The bullet struck the pavement 3 meters behind him as he sprinted across the bridge toward the American embassy gates. And in that instant, the entire architecture of Cold War defection protocols collapsed into a single question of survival. This was March 1985 in Rome, and the man running for his life was Vitaly Yurchenko, a senior KGB officer whose attempt to return to Soviet control after 3 months in CIA custody would trigger one of the most bizarre counterintelligence crises of the decade. But what happens in the minutes and hours after a spy changes his mind about changing sides? And how did the KGB build an entire system designed not just to prevent defections, but to reverse them even after they had seemingly succeeded? The mechanics of defection were never as simple as crossing a border or walking into an embassy. Every Soviet intelligence officer abroad carried the weight of what the KGB called the lever system, a carefully constructed set of pressures that made abandoning the motherland almost unthinkable. Family members remained in Moscow, their addresses known, their work assignments controlled, their children's school admissions dependent on the officer's loyalty. The KGB's second chief directorate maintained detailed psychological profiles on every officer serving overseas, updated quarterly with reports from fellow officers who were themselves being watched. These profiles tracked drinking habits, financial pressures, ideological wavering, sexual affairs, gambling, even the books an officer checked out from embassy libraries. The system was designed to predict defection before the officer himself had fully committed to the idea. If you are watching this because you want to understand how intelligence agencies actually operated beneath the propaganda and the thriller novels, not just what they claim to do, but what their internal documents reveal they feared and prioritized, then subscribe now because this channel exists to surface those mechanisms from newly available archives and declassified files that rewrite what we thought we knew about the Cold War. The first recorded case of the KGB successfully reversing a defection came in 1954, when Lieutenant Nikolai Koklov, who had publicly defected in Frankfurt and denounced Soviet assassination programs, was targeted for elimination with a weapon so exotic it seemed lifted from science fiction. Koklov had been sent to West Germany to assassinate an anti-Soviet émigré leader, but instead walked into a police station and requested asylum, bringing with him an array of concealed weapons, including a cigarette case that fired poison bullets. His defection was a propaganda disaster for Moscow because he gave press conferences, wrote articles, and provided detailed testimony about KGB wet work operations. The KGB response was methodical. First came the character assassination, orchestrated press campaigns in Soviet and sympathetic foreign outlets portraying him as a traitor, embezzler, and degenerate. Then came the family labor, his relatives in Moscow subjected to harassment and public denunciation. But the third phase was the most telling. In September 1957, Koklov collapsed during a conference in Frankfurt, his face swelling, his hair falling out in clumps, his bone marrow ceasing to function. West German doctors discovered he had been poisoned with thallium, delivered through a method never conclusively identified but likely introduced during a brief encounter with a Soviet agent at a public event. He survived only because of experimental treatments with steroids and blood transfusions. The KGB had not succeeded in killing him, but they had sent an unmistakable message to every potential defector watching: distance provides no safety, time provides no statute of limitations, and Western protection is porous. Koklov lived but spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, his effectiveness as a witness compromised by the visible proof that the KGB could reach him whenever they chose. The sophistication of these operations increased dramatically after the disaster of 1961, when Major Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the CIA in Helsinki with information so detailed it led to the exposure of dozens of Soviet agents across Europe. Golitsyn's defection represented a catastrophic breach, not just because of the names he provided, but because of the analytical frameworks he revealed, the way he could explain how KGB counterintelligence thought about Western agencies. In response, the KGB Directorate established what became known as the Special Actions Department, tasked specifically with preventing, reversing, or neutralizing high-level defections. The protocols they developed were taught at the Red Banner Institute and updated constantly based on defection case studies that were analyzed with the intensity of military defeats. The prevention phase began long before an officer went abroad. Financial incentives were calibrated carefully, enough to provide comfort, but not enough to make an officer financially independent. Access to luxury goods through special stores created dependence on the system. Most crucially, the KGB instituted the Friend Officer program, where every intelligence officer posted abroad was paired with another officer, whose job included monitoring for signs of wavering loyalty. These friend officers were themselves monitored by a third layer, creating a surveillance structure so dense that genuine privacy became nearly impossible. Officers learned to perform loyalty even in casual conversations, understanding that an offhand complaint about shortages back home or admiration for Western consumer goods could appear in their file within 24 hours. When prevention failed and an officer began taking preliminary steps toward defection, the KGB response escalated through predetermined phases. The first was the recall telegram, often disguised as a routine administrative matter or a family emergency. Officers were trained to recognize these for what they often were: a test of compliance. Refusing to return immediately triggered phase 2, the family intervention. A wife would receive a phone call suggesting she contact her husband urgently about a sick parent or a child's school problem. These calls were scripted to avoid overt threats, while making clear that family welfare depended on immediate cooperation. If the officer still resisted, phase 3 involved direct confrontation by a senior KGB officer dispatched from Moscow, someone with enough rank to offer credible guarantees, or, if necessary, make explicit what was at stake. The case of Oleg Gordievsky in London in 1971 demonstrated how quickly these phases could unfold and how catastrophically they could fail. Gordievsky was a KGB officer working undercover as a Soviet trade official, but he was also planning acts of sabotage in Britain as part of Department V operations. He was having an affair with his secretary, drinking heavily, and had been spotted by British surveillance meeting with individuals outside normal intelligence channels. When MI5 approached him, he defected almost immediately, providing details that led to the expulsion of 90 Soviet intelligence officers from Britain in a single coordinated action. The KGB's response revealed both the system's power and its limitations. Gordievsky's wife was immediately recalled to Moscow and disappeared into administrative obscurity. His name was blackened in every Soviet publication. But the operational damage was already done, and the KGB could not undo the expelled networks or the revealed methodologies. This failure led to doctrinal revisions. By the mid-1970s, the KGB had developed what internal documents called active measures for defector neutralization, a range of options from character assassination to physical elimination, selected based on the defector's intelligence value and public profile. Low-level defectors might be ignored publicly while being targeted for recruitment, back through family channels or financial offers. High-value defectors like Arkady Shevchenko, the highest-ranking Soviet UN official to defect when he did so in 1978, received the full spectrum of active measures. Shevchenko's wife was held in Moscow essentially as a hostage, while Soviet agents attempted to make contact with him in New York, alternately offering guarantees of safety if he returned and threatening exposure of personal secrets if he continued cooperating with the FBI. The psychological operations were often more sophisticated than the physical threats. The KGB understood that defectors experienced profound isolation, guilt about abandoned families, and identity crises that could be exploited. They planted stories in Soviet media about defectors who had supposedly returned home to forgiveness, carefully staged propaganda designed to make life in exile seem unbearable and return seem possible. They sent letters purportedly from family members, some genuine but others fabricated or written under duress, designed to trigger emotional responses. They tracked defectors' movements and arranged seemingly chance encounters with old colleagues at international venues, conversations that were recorded and analyzed for any sign of regret or willingness to resume contact. Vitaly Yurchenko's case became the most controversial because it seemed to validate these psychological operations while raising questions that remain unresolved decades later. Yurchenko defected in Rome in August 1985 after walking away from his KGB colleagues and presenting himself to the CIA station. He was a senior counterintelligence officer who had served in Washington and knew the identities of numerous agents. During his debriefings, he provided information that led to the identification of two significant penetrations: Ronald Pelton, a former NSA analyst who had sold communications intelligence to the Soviets, and Edward Lee Howard, a disgruntled former CIA officer who had given the KGB details about American operations in Moscow. The intelligence seemed genuine, the debriefings productive, and the CIA believed they had secured a major defector. But Yurchenko appeared increasingly uncomfortable in American custody. He complained about being held virtually prisoner in a CIA safe house, about the intensive debriefings, about being cut off from normal life. He was allowed limited supervised outings, and during one of these, on November 10, 1985, he walked away from his CIA escort at a restaurant in Georgetown, took a taxi to the Soviet compound, and announced he wanted to return home. At a press conference before leaving the United States, he claimed he had been kidnapped in Rome, drugged, and held against his will, and that he was now freely choosing to return to the Soviet Union. The CIA was blindsided. Intelligence analysts immediately debated whether he had been a genuine defector who changed his mind, a plant sent to identify American penetrations of Soviet intelligence, or a genuine defector who had been psychologically manipulated into returning. The evidence suggested a more complex reality than any single explanation could capture. Yurchenko had indeed provided valuable intelligence that damaged Soviet operations, which argued against his being a planned plant. But his behavior during debriefings had been erratic, and he had expressed obsessive interest in a woman he had known in Moscow who was married to a Soviet diplomat in Canada, a personal entanglement that may have overwhelmed his ideological or security concerns. The KGB had decades of experience exploiting exactly these kinds of emotional vulnerabilities. Whether through messages passed via family members, psychological operations designed to amplify his isolation and regret, or simply the weight of his decision bearing down on him in a CIA safe house, something had shifted his calculation. The question of whether he jumped or was pulled back remains disputed. What is not disputed is what happened after he returned to Moscow. By all logic, if Yurchenko had been a genuine defector who revealed Soviet secrets, he should have faced execution as a traitor. Instead, he was reportedly promoted and given a position training KGB officers in counterintelligence. This apparent reward fueled theories that the entire defection had been staged, that he had been sent to feed the CIA information Moscow wanted them to have while identifying American sources and methods. But former KGB officers who later defected suggested a different explanation. The KGB, they said, needed Yurchenko's return to be portrayed as a success, as proof that defection was reversible, and that officers who came back would be treated mercifully. Making an example of him through execution would undermine the message they wanted to send to other wavering officers. Come back, and you will be forgiven. Stay away, and you will never be safe. This propaganda value became clear in how Soviet media handled his return. Yurchenko gave interviews describing his supposed kidnapping and praising the wisdom of returning to the motherland. These interviews were broadcast not just to domestic audiences, but specifically to channels accessible to Soviet personnel serving abroad. The subtext was unmistakable. Defection is reversible, the Americans cannot protect you, and Moscow offers redemption. Whether or not Yurchenko genuinely believed what he was saying, he had become a tool in the KGB's larger strategy of defection deterrence. The active measures extended beyond propaganda. Throughout the 1980s, the KGB maintained teams specifically trained in what they called special actions against defectors. These teams studied the security arrangements around protected witnesses, the patterns of their new lives, the vulnerabilities in Western protective protocols. The 1978 assassination of Georgi Markov in London, killed with a poison pellet delivered via an umbrella tip as he walked across Waterloo Bridge, demonstrated both the reach and the technical sophistication of these operations. Markov was not even a KGB defector but a Bulgarian dissident, yet the operation bore the hallmarks of KGB training and possibly direct assistance to Bulgarian intelligence. The message was clear to actual defectors: borders mean nothing. Time means nothing, and Western security services cannot guarantee your safety. The numbers tell part of the story. Between 1945 and 1991, Western intelligence services recorded approximately 150 to 2,000 attempted or successful defections by KGB and GRU officers, though exact figures remain classified and contested. Of these, at least 12 defectors were confirmed killed by Soviet intelligence operations, with another 20 to 30 dying under circumstances suspicious enough to suggest KGB involvement. At least 5 defectors are known to have returned to Soviet control after initially defecting, though the circumstances varied widely and the true number may be higher given the secrecy surrounding such cases. What these statistics reveal is not just the frequency of defection, but the sustained systematic effort the KGB invested in making defection as dangerous and psychologically costly as possible. The resources devoted to this effort were substantial. The KGB maintained dedicated surveillance teams in cities where defectors were known to have resettled, often tracking individuals for years, waiting for security to lapse or routines to become predictable. They recruited agents specifically for access to Western intelligence agencies' protective services, seeking information about safe house locations, new identity procedures, and resettlement protocols. They analyzed every successful defection for procedural lessons, treating each case as a failure to be studied and prevented in future. The institutional priority given to this mission revealed how seriously the KGB viewed the defection threat, not just as a loss of individual officers but as a challenge to the entire system's credibility. The psychological dimensions were equally calculated. KGB psychologists developed profiles of defector types, categorizing them by motivation, ideological, mercenary, personal grievance, fear of exposure, or romantic entanglement. Each category suggested different vulnerabilities that could be exploited for retrieval or neutralization. Ideological defectors were often beyond persuasion but could be discredited through propaganda. Mercenary defectors might be approached with financial offers or threats. Those motivated by personal grievances could be targeted through family interventions or promises of rehabilitation. The existence of these typologies showed an organization thinking systematically about human motivation and manipulation at scale. The end of the Cold War did not end these operations. It merely changed their context. The assassination of Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006, poisoned with polonium-210 in a killing that bore sophisticated state-level hallmarks, demonstrated continuity in methods even as the ideological framework had shifted from Soviet communism to Russian nationalism. Litvinenko was a former FSB officer who had defected and become a vocal critic of the Russian government, exactly the profile that had triggered KGB active measures in previous decades. The willingness to use a radioactive isotope that would inevitably be traced back to Russian nuclear facilities suggested either supreme confidence in state protection from consequences or a deliberate intent to send a message, technical sophistication, global reach, and willingness to accept international condemnation as the price of demonstrating that defection carries permanent risk. What the KGB did when a spy tried to defect was ultimately about more than any individual case. It was about maintaining a system of control through demonstrated consequences, about making the psychological and physical costs of betrayal so high that the calculation would favor loyalty even when ideology wavered. The lever system, the family hostages, the surveillance networks, the character assassination, the poison umbrellas, and the staged returns were all components of an integrated deterrence architecture built on the assumption that human beings respond to incentives and threats when those are made sufficiently clear and credible. The KGB invested enormous resources in making defection appear simultaneously impossible to complete successfully and devastating to attempt, understanding that perception of risk often mattered more than statistical reality. The question of effectiveness is harder to answer than it might appear. We know about the officers who defected despite the risks because their cases became public. We cannot know how many officers considered defection but were deterred by the very mechanisms designed to prevent it. How many calculated the costs and decided the system's reach was too long and too patient to escape? The KGB's success was not just in the defectors they killed or retrieved, but in the unknown number who never tried, who served out their careers abroad surrounded by temptations and opportunities but ultimately concluded that the risks to themselves and their families exceeded any benefit the West could offer. That invisible deterrence was the system's true achievement, and it functioned precisely because the visible cases, the Litvinenkos and Markovs and Koklovs, demonstrated that the threats were not theoretical. The architecture of control the KGB built around its officers offers uncomfortable lessons about institutional loyalty and the mechanisms states use to bind individuals to service even when conviction falters. It reveals how organizations facing existential risks from internal betrayal will invest extraordinary resources in prevention and punishment, creating systems where surveillance becomes normalized, where family bonds become leverage, and where the past never releases its claim on those who once served. The Cold War ended, but the logic that produced these mechanisms persists wherever organizations value secrecy and fear exposure, wherever the cost of betrayal must be made visible enough to deter those who might be contemplating it, and wherever the state claims the right to pursue its former servants across any border and through any span of years.